The sun was setting over Pine Valley's peaceful streets, painting the sky in soft orange hues as Officer James Barrett steered his patrol car through the neighborhood's pristine lanes. Everything seemed normal in this wealthy suburb, where perfectly manicured lawns stretched out in front of million-dollar homes. Barrett had been working this beat for 8 years, and he took pride in keeping the neighborhood safe, as he liked to tell the residents. As he turned onto Maple Drive, something caught his eye. An older black man in his late 60s was walking slowly along the sidewalk, occasionally stopping to look at house numbers. He wore a simple navy blue sweater and well-worn jeans, nothing fancy, nothing that screamed, "I belong here," to Barrett's prejudiced mind. The man carried a colorfully wrapped present under his arm and kept checking his phone, then looking back at the houses. To most people, this would look like exactly what it was: a grandfather trying to find an address. But Officer Barrett's mind immediately jumped to conclusions. In his 8 years patrolling Pine Valley, he'd developed what he called instincts, though these were really just his own biases dressed up as police work. What Barrett couldn't know through the lens of his prejudice, was that the man he was watching was William Marshall, the state's governor for the past 6 years. Governor Marshall had slipped away from his security detail for just one afternoon, wanting to be just a regular grandpa at his granddaughter's 6th birthday party. His daughter had recently moved to this neighborhood, and he was determined to find her new house without calling for help. "Just want to surprise my little Rose like a normal grandfather," he told his concerned security team. "No cameras, no fuss, just me and my present for my grandbaby." The present was a handmade dollhouse Marshall had spent 3 months crafting in his workshop, his secret hobby that helped him unwind from the pressures of running the state. He painted each tiny room himself, even added working lights and tiny furniture he carefully selected. Rose had been begging for a dollhouse, and her grandfather had poured his heart into making her something special. Barrett slowed his patrol car, watching the governor through narrowed eyes. He saw Marshall pause in front of another house, checking the number, then shaking his head slightly and moving on. To Barrett, this perfectly innocent action somehow translated to casing houses in his mind. The officer's hand tightened on his steering wheel as he watched Marshall adjust his grip on the birthday present. In Barrett's distorted view, he wasn't seeing a loving grandfather carrying a gift. He was seeing what his prejudices wanted him to see: a threat to his neighborhood. Marshall, meanwhile, was lost in happy thoughts about his granddaughter. He imagined Rose's face lighting up when she opened the dollhouse, pictured her exploring each tiny room with wonder. He was so focused on finding the right house number that he didn't notice Barrett's patrol car creeping along behind him, didn't see the officer's suspicious glare. The street was quiet except for the distant sound of children playing somewhere in the neighborhood, probably at the birthday party Marshall was trying to find. A couple of neighbors were out watering their lawns or checking their mail, some giving curious glances at the unfolding scene. Barrett finally pulled his car to the curb, flicking on his blue lights. The reflection bounced off the perfectly clean windows of nearby homes, creating an unnecessary spectacle on the peaceful street. Marshall, hearing the sound of the police car door opening, turned around with a puzzled expression. He still held the wrapped dollhouse carefully, making sure not to damage his labor of love. The next few moments would change both men's lives forever, though neither knew it yet. As Barrett stepped out of his car, hand already resting on his belt, the setting sun cast long shadows across Maple Drive. A few residents, sensing something was about to happen, began to gather on their porches. Some already had their phones out, ready to record whatever came next. Marshall stood perfectly still, his grandfather's instincts telling him to stay calm, to protect the gift he'd made with such care. His years of political experience had taught him how to handle tense situations, but right now, he wasn't the governor. He was just a black man being confronted by a police officer who'd already decided he didn't belong. The warm evening air grew heavy with tension as Barrett approached, his boots clicking against the sidewalk with each deliberate step. Inside the wrapped package, the tiny lights of the dollhouse waited to shine for a little girl's birthday, unaware that their moment might be delayed by something much darker than a wrong turn on a peaceful suburban street. Unknown to both men, this encounter would soon become more than just another case of racial profiling. It would become a moment that would spark conversations across the nation and change hearts and minds in ways neither could imagine as they stood there on that quiet street in Pine Valley. "Let me see your hands," Barrett barked, his voice shattering the peaceful evening air. Governor Marshall slowly turned to face the officer, still carefully holding his granddaughter's wrapped dollhouse. The setting sun cast long shadows between them as neighbors began peeking through their windows, drawn by the commotion on their usually quiet street. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate," Marshall replied calmly, his voice carrying the patience of a man who'd seen too many similar situations in his lifetime. "I'm just trying to find my daughter's house. She recently moved to the neighborhood." He spoke with the measured tone he'd learned through decades of public service, though right now that experience felt distant. He was just a grandfather trying to make it to a birthday party. Barrett stepped closer, his hand still resting on his belt. "Put the package down slowly and step away from it." His voice carried an edge that made several watching neighbors uncomfortable enough to start recording on their phones. A woman in a blue sundress stood on her porch, phone raised, her free hand covering her mouth in concern. "This is my granddaughter's birthday present," Marshall explained, still maintaining his composure. "I spent months making it for her. If you'll allow me to reach for my wallet." "I said put it down," Barrett interrupted, his voice rising. "You can explain everything after you comply with my commands." The officer's face was tight with suspicion, his preconceptions blinding him to the reality of the situation. Carefully, Marshall placed the wrapped dollhouse on the nearest lawn, making sure it rested safely on level ground. Inside the package, the tiny furniture he'd so carefully arranged rattled slightly. He thought about the little reading nook he'd created in the dollhouse's library, with its miniature books and tiny reading lamp, how Rose's eyes would light up when she saw it. Now he worried whether the gift would make it to her at all. A small crowd had gathered at a safe distance. A young couple with their dog stood frozen on their evening walk, the husband whispering urgently into his phone. An elderly woman watched from her garden, her watering can forgotten in her hands as the scene unfolded. "Now, turn around and place your hands behind your back," Barrett ordered, pulling out his handcuffs. The metal clinked ominously in the evening air. "Officer, I really must insist," Marshall began, but Barrett cut him off by roughly grabbing his arm. The governor winced, not from pain, but from the realization that his position, his accomplishments, his lifetime of public service meant nothing in this moment. To this officer, he was just another suspect who didn't belong in this neighborhood. The handcuffs clicked shut around Marshall's wrists, cold metal pressing against skin that had signed state laws and shaken hands with presidents. A neighbor's child watched from a window, face pressed against the glass, learning a lesson about the world that no parent would ever want to teach. "You're making a serious mistake," Marshall said quietly, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact. "My ID is in my back pocket, if you just check." "Save it for the station," Barrett snapped, beginning to pat down the governor with unnecessary roughness. The small crowd had grown larger now, and the murmurs of concern were getting louder. Someone mentioned calling the police station directly. Others were already sharing their videos online. A car slowed as it passed, the driver clearly recognizing the man in handcuffs. Her eyes widened in shock, and she quickly pulled over, joining the growing number of witnesses. "Oh my God," she whispered to her passenger, "that's Governor Marshall." But Barrett didn't hear her. He was too focused on his perceived victory, on proving his instincts right. He began reciting Miranda rights with an air of satisfaction, each word falling like another brick in the wall of his own prejudice. Marshall stood straight despite the handcuffs, his dignity intact even as his rights were being violated. He thought about his granddaughter waiting for him at her party, probably watching the door for her grandpa to arrive. He thought about the dollhouse sitting on the grass, the wrapping paper slightly torn from its rough placement. All he'd wanted was to be a normal grandfather for one afternoon. As Barrett began leading him toward the patrol car, a teenager on his bike skidded to a stop nearby. The boy's jaw dropped as he recognized the governor from a recent school field trip to the state capitol. He frantically pulled out his phone, his hands shaking as he typed. The neighbors' phones were buzzing now with incoming messages and notifications. The news was spreading rapidly through social media, and soon the quiet street would become the center of a national story. But for now, Marshall focused on staying calm, on being the example he always tried to be. "Officer," he tried one last time as they reached the patrol car, "I understand you're doing your job, but I strongly suggest you verify my identity before taking this any further." His voice remained steady, though his heart ached thinking about Rose's disappointment when he didn't show up at her party. Barrett responded by roughly pushing Marshall's head down as he guided him into the back seat. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed through the neighborhood. Inside the car, Marshall could see his granddaughter's present still sitting on the lawn, its cheerful wrapping paper a stark contrast to the dark situation. As Barrett got into the driver's seat, the governor closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In all his years of public service, in all his work on police reform and racial justice, he'd never imagined he'd experience it quite this personally. The patrol car pulled away from the curb, leaving behind a shocked neighborhood, a growing social media storm, and a handmade dollhouse waiting to bring joy to a little girl who was still watching the door, wondering why her grandpa was late to her party. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Barrett proudly marched Governor Marshall through the police station doors. The evening shift was in full swing, with officers moving about their routine duties, paperwork being filed, and phones ringing in the background. The governor walked with quiet dignity despite the handcuffs, his thoughts still with his granddaughter's birthday party. "Got a suspicious character from Pine Valley," Barrett announced to the booking officer, chest puffed with unearned confidence. "Caught him prowling around, probably casing houses." He spoke as if he just caught a master criminal rather than a grandfather looking for a birthday party. The booking officer, a heavy-set man with reading glasses perched on his nose, barely looked up from his computer screen. Just another arrest on a quiet evening shift, or so he thought. Marshall stood patiently, watching the scene unfold with the careful eye of someone who'd spent years studying police procedures for reform proposals. "I really must insist again that you check my identification," Marshall said quietly. His voice carried the same calm authority he used in state senate meetings, though it seemed to bounce off Barrett's willful ignorance. A few nearby officers glanced over, something about the arrested man's composed demeanor catching their attention. "Listen," Barrett said, leaning close to Marshall's face, "I don't care what story you've cooked up. We'll get to your ID after booking. Right now, you're just another suspect trying to talk his way out of trouble." He grabbed Marshall's arm to guide him toward the fingerprinting station. An older sergeant walking past suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He turned slowly, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth, and stared at Marshall. 25 years on the force had trained him to notice details, and right now, those details were screaming at him. "Wait a minute," he said, taking a step closer. "Is that—" The booking officer finally looked up properly, adjusting his glasses. His face went pale as recognition dawned. The coffee cup in the sergeant's hand slipped, hitting the floor with a splash that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet station. "Oh my God," the sergeant whispered. "That's Governor Marshall." The word governor rippled through the station like a shockwave. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and several officers rushed forward. Barrett's smug expression faltered as he watched his colleagues' reactions. "What? No, this is just some suspicious guy from—" "You arrested the governor?" The booking officer stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. "Governor William Marshall, the man who signed the Police Benefits Extension Act last month." Barrett's face drained of color as the reality of the situation crashed over him. His hands began to shake as he watched the sergeant quickly unlock the handcuffs from Marshall's wrists. The governor rubbed his wrists gently, still maintaining his dignified composure even as chaos erupted around him. "Someone call the chief." An officer shouted, already reaching for a phone, "and get the mayor on the line." Another voice called out. The station transformed from its usual evening routine into a flurry of panicked activity. Officers scrambled to bring water, offer chairs, make calls, anything to try to minimize the disaster unfolding before them. Barrett stood frozen, his career flashing before his eyes. The swagger he'd walked in with had evaporated, replaced by a cold sweat of realization. He watched as his fellow officers treated Marshall with the respect he'd deserved all along, now seeing what Barrett's prejudice had blinded him to. A distinguished public servant who dedicated his life to serving their state. "Governor, sir, I am so deeply sorry," the sergeant said, pulling out a chair. "Can we get you anything? Water?" Coffee? Should we call your security detail? His hands were shaking slightly as he tried to manage the situation. Marshall sat down carefully, straightening his sweater. Actually, he said, his voice steady but tired, I'm more concerned about my granddaughter's birthday present. It's still sitting on someone's lawn in Pine Valley. It's a dollhouse I made for her. Today's her 6th birthday. The guilt on the officers' faces deepened at this simple human detail. Someone immediately grabbed car keys, volunteering to retrieve the gift. Through the station's windows, they could see news vans already beginning to arrive, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like metal flowers blooming in the night. The police chief burst through the door, still pulling on his jacket, face flushed from rushing to the station. His eyes went wide as he saw Marshall sitting calmly in the booking area. "Governor Marshall, sir," he stammered, "I can't begin to express." "Chief," Marshall interrupted gently, "I think we need to have a serious discussion about racial profiling in your department." He gestured toward Barrett, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "This incident, while unfortunate for me personally, might provide an opportunity for meaningful change." The station fell silent again, every person there knowing they were witnessing a moment that would have repercussions far beyond their precinct. Outside, camera lights began to flash as reporters gathered, the story already spreading across social media and news networks. Marshall stood up, straightening to his full height. The same quiet dignity that had carried him through the humiliating arrest now filled the room with authority. "Now, if someone could please help me get to my granddaughter's birthday party. I believe I'm rather late, and there's a little girl waiting for her grandfather and her dollhouse." The chief personally offered to drive him, keys already in hand. As they walked toward the door, Marshall paused beside Barrett, who stood rigid with shame and fear. "Officer Barrett," he said softly, so only Barrett could hear, "tomorrow, we're going to talk about how this can be a learning experience for everyone involved. Tonight, I just want to get to my granddaughter's party." As Marshall walked out of the station, followed by apologetic officers and approached by shouting reporters, he held on to that single focus, his granddaughter's smile, waiting for him at a party that had probably ended hours ago. Sometimes, he reflected, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, even a grandfather just trying to deliver a birthday present. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the governor's office, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor. Governor Marshall sat at his desk, reviewing the footage from his arrest that had now gone viral across every social media platform. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages of support, outrage, and media requests since the incident. He watched the video again, saw himself standing calmly while being handcuffed, the wrapped dollhouse sitting forgotten on a stranger's lawn. The clip had been viewed millions of times overnight. News channels were running it on repeat, sparking heated discussions about racial profiling and police reform across the nation. A gentle knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. His assistant poked her head in, her face concerned. "Sir, your daughter's on line 1. And there are about 50 reporters camped outside the building." She paused, then added softly, "Rose loved the dollhouse, by the way. She's been playing with it all morning." Marshall smiled, remembering how he'd finally made it to his daughter's house late last night. Rose had been allowed to stay up way past her bedtime just this once to wait for her grandpa. The joy on her face when she unwrapped the dollhouse had almost made the whole ordeal worthwhile. Almost. "Thank you," he said, reaching for the phone. But before he could pick it up, his assistant added, "Also, Officer Barrett's disciplinary hearing is scheduled for this afternoon. The police chief wants to know if you'll be attending." Marshall leaned back in his chair, thinking about Barrett. The officer's face had haunted him all night, not with anger, but with a sense of opportunity. He'd seen something in Barrett's eyes at the station, something beyond just fear of consequences. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for real change. Instead of immediately firing Barrett or pressing charges, Marshall had spent the night drafting a different kind of response. He pulled the document up on his computer screen now, a comprehensive plan for reform that went far beyond just punishing one officer. "Cancel the disciplinary hearing," he said finally. His assistant looked surprised, but he continued, "Instead, set up a meeting with Barrett, the police chief, and the head of our new community relations board. And call the state education department. I want to discuss implementing expanded bias training across all law enforcement agencies." Throughout the day, Marshall's office became a hub of activity. Community leaders arrived for meetings, police reform experts offered suggestions, and his team worked tirelessly to craft a response that would turn this incident into real change. The governor insisted that every proposal include not just punishment, but education and understanding. Barrett, meanwhile, sat at home on administrative leave, watching the news coverage with a growing sense of shame. His phone was filled with messages too, mostly from fellow officers expressing disbelief, and a few from old friends asking how he could have made such a mistake. The officer who'd always prided himself on good instincts was finally seeing those instincts for what they really were, prejudices that had no place in modern policing. When the call came from the governor's office, Barrett expected the worst. Instead, he was invited to be part of something bigger than himself. The governor's plan was both simple and revolutionary. Barrett would undergo extensive racial bias training, but he'd also become part of the solution. Over the next few months, the incident that could have ended Barrett's career became a catalyst for change. The governor's office established new training programs, with Barrett's story as a central case study. Community meetings were held where residents could share their experiences with law enforcement, and officers were required to listen. Marshall made sure the changes weren't just symbolic. He worked with state legislators to pass new laws requiring better training and accountability. But more importantly, he made sure the human element wasn't lost in the bureaucracy. He shared his own story, not as the governor who was wrongly arrested, but as a grandfather who just wanted to give his granddaughter a birthday present. The media attention eventually died down, but the work continued. Marshall regularly visited police academies to share his experience, always bringing photos of the dollhouse and his granddaughter. He found that personal stories often reached hearts in ways that lectures and laws couldn't. One particularly meaningful moment came when Barrett was assigned to community service in neighborhoods he'd once viewed with suspicion. He met families, played basketball with kids, and learned the stories behind the faces he previously judged unfairly. The officer who'd once seen threats on every corner began to see humanity instead. Rose's dollhouse sat proudly in her room, its tiny rooms filled with the imagination of a 6-year-old. She didn't fully understand why her grandpa's story was on TV, or why people kept talking about the day he was late to her party. But she did notice that he brought Officer Barrett to visit one day, and that both men seemed different somehow, lighter, as if they'd put down a heavy burden neither had known they were carrying. Sometimes, Marshall told his granddaughter as they played with the dollhouse together, the best way to fix a mistake is to learn from it and help others learn too. Rose nodded solemnly, carefully arranging the tiny furniture her grandfather had made with such care, unaware that her birthday present had become a symbol of change for an entire community. The incident that began with prejudice and handcuffs was transforming into something powerful, a story of redemption, education, and the possibility of change. Marshall knew there was still much work to be done, but as he watched Barrett speaking to a group of new police recruits about his experience, he felt hope. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best chances for growth, if we're brave enough to seize them. 6 months had passed since that evening in Pine Valley. The autumn leaves were falling outside the community center where Officer Barrett stood before a room full of fellow police officers. His hands were steady now as he adjusted the microphone, though his heart still raced whenever he told this story. "I thought I knew what good policing looked like," he began, looking across the faces of officers from departments across the state. "I thought my suspicions and snap judgments were keeping people safe. I was wrong." The room was quiet enough to hear a pin drop. These training sessions had become a regular part of the state's new police reform program, but Barrett's sessions were different because he spoke from personal experience. In the back of the room sat Governor Marshall, watching quietly. He hadn't announced his presence. He preferred to observe these sessions naturally. Besides, today wasn't about him. It was about Barrett's journey, about turning a mistake into a lesson that could change hearts and minds. Barrett clicked to the next slide, showing the viral video of the arrest. He no longer flinched when he watched it, though the shame still burned in his chest. "This was the moment I almost destroyed my career, but more importantly, the moment I realized how my biases were hurting innocent people and the community I swore to protect." The officer went on to describe the changes he'd experienced during his intensive training and community service. He talked about the families he'd met, the stories he'd heard, the perspectives he'd gained. His voice cracked slightly as he described a dinner he'd been invited to at the home of an elderly couple in a neighborhood he'd once viewed with suspicion. They shared photos of their grandchildren, Barrett said, just like the dollhouse Governor Marshall was trying to deliver that day. We're all just people, trying to live our lives, love our families, and make it home safely each day. In the months since the incident, the changes in the police department had been significant. The governor's reform program, now known as the Pine Valley Initiative, had become a model for departments across the country. But the real changes were happening in smaller, more personal ways. After the training session, Marshall watched as officers lined up to speak with Barrett. Many shared their own stories of confronting biases they hadn't even realized they carried. The conversation was open, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable, exactly what real change required. Later that afternoon, Marshall had invited Barrett to his office for their monthly check-in. These meetings had become a tradition, a way to ensure the reforms weren't just surface-level changes. The governor's office looked different now, with children's artwork decorating one wall, drawings sent by kids from community outreach programs, including a crayon masterpiece from Rose. The dollhouse is still her favorite toy, Marshall mentioned as Barrett settled into a chair. She's added her own touches, some superhero figures living alongside the fancy furniture I made. He chuckled, pulling out his phone to show a recent photo. The handmade dollhouse now sported tiny cape-wearing action figures having tea parties in its carefully crafted rooms. Barrett smiled at the photo, remembering how differently things could have turned out. My daughter asked me about that day recently, he said. She's learning about civil rights in school. It led to a long conversation about prejudice and change. She told me she's proud of the work I'm doing now. The two men spent the next hour reviewing the progress of their reforms. Crime rates hadn't risen as some had feared. Instead, community trust was growing. Complaints against officers had decreased, while voluntary community engagement had increased. More importantly, other departments were taking notice. We have requests from 12 other states to implement similar programs, Marshall said, shuffling through some papers on his desk. They want you to come speak to their departments, share your experience. Barrett nodded thoughtfully. 6 months ago, I thought my career was over. Now I have the chance to help make sure other officers don't make the same mistakes I did. He paused, then added, My mom always said everything happens for a reason. Maybe she was right. The governor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. You know what Rose said to me last week? She was playing with her dollhouse, and she told me, Grandpa, the dolls were fighting, but I made them talk to each other, and now they're friends. Sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places. Just then, Marshall's assistant knocked on the door. Sir, the community council is ready for your meeting. They're discussing the expansion of the youth mentorship program. The governor nodded, then turned back to Barrett. Speaking of which, how's the coaching going? He asked. Part of Barrett's community service had involved coaching a youth basketball team. He'd kept it up even after his required hours were complete. Barrett's face lit up. We made it to the finals. The kids are amazing. You should come to a game sometime. These young people, they've taught me more than any training manual could. As they wrapped up their meeting, Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from his daughter. Another photo of Rose playing with the dollhouse popped up on his screen. This time, she'd added a tiny police car alongside the other toys, but instead of chasing anyone, the miniature officer was having a tea party with the other dolls. Progress comes in small steps, Marshall said, showing Barrett the photo. Sometimes it's policy changes and training programs, and sometimes it's a child's game showing us how things could be. Walking toward the door, Barrett paused. Governor, he said, his voice serious, thank you. Not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me how to be better. How to really serve and protect everyone in our community. Marshall shook his head. Thank you for being willing to change, to learn, to help others learn. That's what real courage looks like. As Barrett left the office, Marshall looked again at the photo of Rose's dollhouse. The toy police car sat peacefully among the other toys, a small but powerful symbol of how things could change. Outside his window, the autumn leaves continued to fall, each one a reminder that transformation was natural, necessary, and beautiful in its own way. The incident that could have ended in tragedy had instead sparked a movement of understanding and change. It hadn't been easy. Real change never is. But as Marshall prepared for his next meeting, he smiled, thinking about how a birthday present, a mistake, and a willingness to learn had come together to create something meaningful. Rose's dollhouse sat in her room, its tiny lights still glowing warmly each night, now watching over a diverse collection of toys living together in harmony. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest things: a grandfather's love, an officer's awakening, and a child's simple wisdom about making friends instead of fighting.